Hello, everyone. Welcome to our talk, which is called TeamTNT and Explosion Crypto Mining. So my name is Joakim Kennedy, and I'm a security researcher at Intezer. I see myself as an assembly reader, and on my spare time, I like to hunt for gophers.
Hello, my name is Nicole Fishbein. I'm a security researcher at Intezer. My main focus are threats targeting the cloud. And on my spare time, either I'm at the gym, drawing, or working on projects for my Raspberry Pi.
So what we're going to do today is we're going to go over a little bit quickly, first about who TeamTNT is. And then we're going to go through their sort of chronological history of what they've done the past year and a half, somewhat. And it kind of plays out a little bit as a kind of a Shakespearean tragedy where you kind of start a little bit with like a Redis phase and moving in towards like the cloud and targeting, then expanding into clusters and things like that. And then sort of like a little bit of a disaster when you become too famous. So to start out, what is cryptojacking? Well, so cryptojacking is just essentially illicit crypto mining on someone else's resources. And TeamTNT is actually one of the sort of more predominant actors in this field. They've been sort of active since, if we kind of go to the beginning, so they've actually been active since around like the winter of 2020. And their targeting first started just by actually attacking Redis servers, which is sort of a common thing that we see with crypto miner threat actors. They seem to targeting Redis first, sort of an easy thing to target. And what they used is they used multiple scanners, but mainly what they used back then was PN scan. They would scan the whole internet to see any sort of services that were listening on the Redis port, and then they would send sort of like the flush all payload if they can sort of access it to overwrite a cron job and then sort of install their crypto miner. And their attack is kind of interesting because it has a lot of files. There's a lot of script files that they kind of broken out with a lot of functionality. But they also used back then also like a lot of binary tools. One of the things they use first is it's a malware called Tsunami. Also goes by the name of like Chitin or Sigistardux. It's an open source botnet that was released back in the day on Packet Storm, but it's sort of been maintained and forked and updated. The other thing they used back then is a backdoor called Rathole. The things in the parentheses are the file name during this campaign. Rathole was later dropped, but they started using Tsunami, but using the Rathole file name instead. The other sort of binary file they used was just a watchdog C application that would just sort of restart software if it was killed. And the other interesting thing was they pulled in post-exploitation tools, so PunkPy, which is a tool that attacks other SSH servers, so you can sort of move laterally through SSH and execute a bunch of commands. So they utilize that. And then what they would do is exfiltrate a bunch of stuff, like SSH keys, bash history, known host names, and things like that. So they would also do a lot of like information gathering in addition to mining. We kind of put the beginning of sort of like the TeamTNT umbrella, like when they started, around mid-February 2020. This was when they registered their domain name. The oldest file served that we could manage to grab was uploaded on the 14th, so just 4 days after the domain was registered. So this kind of put like the starting point where they actually went out and sort of took on this sort of persona of TeamTNT. This is the campaign, kind of how it all is laid out. All of this sort of script files used. So it actually starts with the load /setup sh file. That's sort of the path on the C2 server, which is the load. And then all of the arrows out is the files that it downloads. unless it's sort of like a labeled saying and written, but it just downloads a whole bunch of different script files that has a bunch of stuff. Most of this is actually loaded directly into memory and just piped into a shell, so it never touches disk. So if you don't manage to get a hold of sort of the setup file and can start from the beginning, it's hard to get hold of everything. The interesting thing with this group was kind of seemed like they were a German speaker. The shell scripts are sort of littered with a lot of like comments in German, and the other interesting bit is sort of like the copyright header they put on top of their script file. You know, like the private module scan pwn for Redis server, and you know the Poorman's SSH binding effector. It's kind of funny, but this is sort of like the first sort of sign of like where they might come from. One interesting shell script that was part of this campaign is this hid file. What it does, so here's actually sort of part of the installer. It will actually create this hid file that's executed. It's intended to be executed with an argument, where the argument is a PID, so a process ID. And it actually first like moves the mtable file, and then it mounts an empty folder over the proc folder where the PID is located. So like the proc/the PID ID. That is the location where you can sort of gather a lot of information about a running process. It's a pseudo file system. And the intention here is to hide this file or this process from tools such as PS and top that would walk that file system and list all the processes. Now, the interesting, in newer versions of Linux, some distributions, I think Ubuntu 2004, that is not a file. It's actually just a symlink that points directly into the proc file system, which means this technique doesn't work. Back then it did work, I think Ubuntu 18.04, this would work. And also, like if you run like the mount command directly on a Linux box, it will print out all the mount points. It fetches that information from another location, so it doesn't sort of. You still find that something is weird is going on your proc system, but it's an interesting sort of approach to kind of do a little bit of like a user level hiding stuff from other processes. And then they also have this kind of interesting SSH poor man logger. It's using strace and intended to capture login credentials as used if an admin would log on to the box and jump on to something else. This file then is installed by actually just adding an alias in the bash rc to override just the SSH command. And then there's a cron job that is installed that runs every 5 minutes, and it will execute a tiny little shell script that will upload these logs to the C2 server. So early on, from like the first sort of campaign that we saw with this group, they had a pretty massive sort of tool set and started out with like using everything. The one of the binaries, the Tsunami, is a sort of a code overlap between other malware families that we sort of track. It's, as I said, it's known as Chitin or Sigistartux. Chitin is the older version. Sigistartux is a newer, updated sort of fork of it that's been sort of improved. The version that TeamTNT uses is based on the very old version. There's probably about 50 to 100 different GitHub repos with that version, so it's hard to tell where it actually came from. This malware is used as a denial service bot, so it can be used in a distributed denial service, but it also has the shell command functionality, so you can execute any commands you want, and that's mainly the use that we see probably the actors doing. I haven't seen them sort of engaging in any DDoS attacks. The way they are specifically used, way their specific version of it would run, it would replace its name as a kernel thread. So kind of just disguising itself.
Thank you. So another tool they used called Rathole is an open source Linux backdoor. It has several capabilities, including process name hiding, offering a preferable shell, and encryption of communication using algorithm called Blowfish. And when we analyzed a binary that we found in one of TeamTNT's campaigns to the binary that we compiled from the original repository, we found one major difference, and that's the string TeamTNT as part of the encryption function. And TeamTNT, as you know, is a big part of the identity. That's how we know this group, and that's a string that we're going to see in the upcoming campaigns that we're going to describe here. And another interesting thing is that the binary that we analyzed was submitted to VirusTotal in early 2019, before they registered the domain and before the really big evidence of their campaign attacking people. So this is a very first artifact of the group with the string TeamTNT. Another thing that we did, we analyzed an archive file containing several cryptominers and a script called rstat.sh. When we analyzed the host name that we saw in the script, we found another script, as you can see on the other side, and it has several capabilities. It creates an SSH account for the name Hilda, for the user Hilda, sets up persistence using cron tab, as described before, and it creates another user, root user called Hilda, and the password is guard. That's the hashed part. And Hildegard is another super important part of TeamTNT's activity. First of all, that's the name of their Twitter account. And another thing, we're going to see it as before in more scripts. Moving on to Spring 2020. So Spring 2020 was when many threat actors started to use misconfigured Docker services to launch attacks. And TeamTNT did that as well. And as before, they use many scripts, open source tools. Some of them they reused from the previous campaign when they targeted Redis. And they used some of the COVID-19 situation. So first of all, to find a misconfigured Docker service, it's relatively easy. You need to scan the network, find exposed ports, the exposed service, and launch the attack. And that's exactly what they did, using two open source tools. One is zgrab, and the other one is Mescan. Once they found the victim, they would create a container on the victim using a legitimate Alpine image, and then pass it an argument to download and execute a script. So at this point, they didn't use malicious Docker images. The whole malicious activity was executed by the scripts. And as before, we see a lot of scripts, or each script calls another one, and each script has its own dedicated duty or job. It could be install admin tools, remove previously installed malware, set up persistence, and so on. And we analyzed the scripts that we saw in several campaigns like that, and we found a script that is really low detected on VirusTotal up until last week. And the interesting part here is that it was submitted in Spring 2020, but it targets Redis and not Docker. So from here, we understand that they did not shift their entire focus to Docker. Rather, they expanded their victim arsenal. In Spring 2020, the COVID situation was very bad. So many people died. The number of new cases grew rapidly each day. And many countries and regions were under strict lockdowns. And many threat actors abused the situation to launch phishing attacks. But as we know, TeamTNT is not in phishing attacks, but they did use some of the COVID-19 buzzwords or terms in their scripts. And there is no obvious reason for that.
to summer. Sort of the continuation of targeting Docker. Slight modifications to it, in addition to sort of basing the attack on the Alpine container or image. They also started using just a straight up like the Ubuntu container. Also, this was added. So this is part of the sort of the attack payload, where it sort of scans and fingerprints using zgrab, as Nicole was talking about earlier. And then it tries to just run curl and execute the setup script. And if that doesn't work, well, just include all the setup stuff as base64 and just chuck that in too. So it has like a backup where it's like this echo statement is executed in case the first one fails. The other interesting part that was added, one of the scripts will download the Amorphin, which is an open source rootkit. It will download and actually will download and install a tool chain to install it, and it will compile it and try to run it. So you ever seen like moving from like the homegrown kind of like userland kind of approach to hide to actually using kernel level rootkits. Continuation with sort of like moving on, grabbing sort of credentials and things like that. Here's sort of the shell scripts that it grabs all the credentials for SSH, and it tries to find all the known hosts in multiple locations, any possible usernames, any possible ports. And then this is then just looped through, and it will just try to log in and execute. So they are very interested in sort of like getting a foothold and then just try to move if the machine that they've compromised is being used as like a jump post or something like that, or you have access to other machines via that. There you go.
All right, so fall 2020 was a time of changes or new features that we saw in TeamTNT. So first of all, as our research team found, TeamTNT spotted using an open source tool called wifscope. So wifscope is a very easy to install tool that gives you full monitoring capabilities over containers and Kubernetes nodes. And once installed, it creates a dashboard, which can be accessible from the browser. And as you can see, you have a lot of information about the images, about the containers, the resource use, and even a nice shell to run commands inside the container. So TeamTNT basically installed it on the victims. And this way, they had a full functional backdoor without using a malicious file or malicious backdoor. Another thing they did, as reported by Palo Alto, they expanded their credential stealing capabilities. So up until this moment, they stole SSH credentials and AWS. Now they used two, as before, open source tools. One is called MimiPenguin, and the other one is MimiPy. So MimiPenguin is a Linux implementation of Mimikatz, dumping all the processes, looking for passwords and plain text passwords. And the other one is MimiPy, which is based on MimiPenguin, and it has ability to store passwords from network connections and browser history and so on. As tweeted by ESET, they spotted using Izuri. So Izuri is a crypto written in Golang. It's open source. And TeamTNT used it to launch fileless attacks. So they encrypted the malicious payload, and this way they evaded detection by standard security tools. And I think that up until this moment, they're using Izuri. And another important thing that happened in this time is the creation of their social media account on Twitter. So as you can see, we have Hildegard, TeamTNT, and he's saying that they're from Germany, and that's why the presentation had like all these German themes and times in German. So most of the tweets are actually in German. We analyzed all the tweets. We saw that they were active through the whole hours of the day, preferably late afternoon to the evening. And they tweet about really a bunch of things, German politics, some usual tweets and so on. They openly talking about their activity, and that's something is very unique for a threat actor to openly discuss what they're doing. they don't see themselves as the criminals or the bad guys. So that's an interesting thing to see as well. They're very communicative. They talk a lot sometimes. And they react in response to researchers and companies that publish information about them. So for example, here, they retweeted to our publication about one of their campaigns. They mentioned the mount trick, which was explained before. So it's very interesting to see that. Thank you.
So winter 2021. Lacework Labs released a report. They sort of analyzed the Tsunami bot that was used, and they found the username and password to log into the IRC server that's used for the C2, and to sort of collect a little bit of information about what kind of stuff are they infecting. And they sort of gathered and found that it was about 200 live bots at the time. Of that, about 90 unique IP addresses, which kind of is something that doesn't seem surprising with the amount of sort of lateral movement that they're doing. So it's likely that a lot of these machines are sitting behind the same sort of external IP address. Most of the infected machines were in cloud instances in Asia, mostly Tencent, Alibaba, and even Amazon. During this time, they also added the libprocess hider, which is a userland rootkit kind of functionality. It hooks the function in libc to actually, you can use it to hide files, to hide any processes. It does leave some information on the machine that it's there, which is through a file for LD preload, which is a instruction to the loader to load in sort of this tool before any other shared object is loaded. They also shifted or kind of added to their attack chain. So at this point, most of the Redis stuff is gone. They're still focusing on Docker, but they also added Kubernetes. So now they're targeting directly and try to deploy stuff on the pods that are on the clusters. They sort of more embrace the use of this cryptor or packer to sort of disguise their stuff. So in starting just the Cryptomining will be packed, and also the bots that they use and everything. So they all kind of run from memory once they're executed. The other interesting bit is like at this point, if you looked at sort of like their infrastructure, so on VirusTotal, so we noticed there was 2 files that were actually identified as PE files that was hosted on their infrastructure. The first of this file, called the sniffer file, is a compiled AutoIt script that is designed to do packet capture and capture credentials. The other file is the xmrig compiled for CUDA. This file, when it's run, it also drops a Windows driver that we identified as WinRing0 from, which is an open source driver, but this one is signed by the openlibsys.org. So probably something you don't want on your system. It allows userland applications to execute code in Ring0. xmrig uses that on Windows. It comes as part of the sort of like the bundle package. What it's using it for is to disable some, I think it's some caching by accessing some MSR registers that are not accessible in the userland, and that kind of improves the performance. But to do that, it needs to drop essentially a backdoor into the kernel to run kernel code.
So next, they expanded their credential stealing capabilities even more. They added more paths where they're looking for more passwords for other services, including FileZilla or Cryptominer wallets. Google Cloud credentials, and so on. And the researchers that reported it were Trend Micro. And as you can see, TeamTNT retweeted their original post, so probably they approved their findings. Next, they used AWS CLI, which is a very powerful tool to get as much information basically as you want about the environment in AWS. So that's only part of the screenshot of the script that they used. They gather information about the instances, their resources, volumes, network, accounts, permissions, everything that they could get their hands on. Next, as reported by Trend Micro, they released a post saying that 50,000 servers were compromised by TeamTNT. And here it seems that TeamTNT didn't agree and basically said, you should check your facts. So this is one of the interactions that we see between the group and the researchers. And another interesting thing, a researcher on Twitter posted some scripts and attributed it to a campaign from TeamTNT and said that TeamTNT replied saying that's not us, and someone else is using our scripts. Things got even more interesting when Palo Alto released a very big post about one of TeamTNT's campaigns. And TeamTNT once again responded saying that someone else is using our old scripts, that's not us, and you should verify your findings.
Thank you. A little bit of mud in the water there. So in a reaction to sort of the copycat, they released this information where they will essentially, we're going to tag it, everything that we have that's ours. Remind you that they already had that. There was a copyright header at the top of sort of like the initial campaign. Now this kind of has been dropped a little bit, and it's not usually there. But here they kind of go and we kind of sort of put it back in. So this is what they added. So it sort of gives the date, the version, and usually below this, there is also a URL where you can download a refreshed version of the file so you can fetch it directly from their server. So they really didn't like this copycat kind of taking their stuff. That file was part of the campaign that they kind of named Chimera. Started in late July. And we only started targeting wifscope, Docker, and Kubernetes. The other sort of services that they have listed there, we never saw any attacks or any scripts that actually would try to attack any of those. And they seem to be kind of keeping an eye on what's going on. They've always used sort of tools to try to break out of containers and things like that. And here's sort of like a reply to Palo Alto's Azure Escape that was published this summer, or like this fall, I guess is when it happened, in September. So just to sort of summarize everything up, so in terms of like cryptojacking, it actually is one of the major sort of threats that's targeting the Linux environment. And it kind of involves even, just servers on-prem, but also like cloud instances. And in sort of this area, TeamTNT has been one of the major sort of actors that've been sort of targeting most stuff out there. Now, currently, going back just a couple of weeks back, they've mainly just been targeting Docker and Kubernetes. So like all that like Redis stuff and other things seem to be dropped. As we've seen a little bit of dabbling in targeting sort of Windows, especially like Windows stuff on clouds, possibly to access stuff that would have graphics cards to just boost the mining. The interesting with this actor is their sort of public persona. Most of the cryptojacking threat actors we see there, they're silent. You don't have anything. They're very, very active, and they respond to researchers, and they point out if you miss something and if you do any misinterpretation or anything like that. But most of their tooling is actually sort of based on open source stuff. So as sort of like defenders, the tools are out there. More of the magic that you do is how they kind of glue it together, which is sort of through the shell script. I'll leave you guys with like one of the sort of tweets from TeamTNT, which they sort of released not that long ago, where they kind of like started with the next phase, and we'll see who will catch the next campaign. Thank you.